Hello, I'm Jim Rosenberg, the head of social media here at the World Bank, and joining me today is Andrew Mitchell, the UK Secretary of State for International Development. Secretary Mitchell, thank you for joining us today.
Good morning.
Thank you so much. What's at the top of your agenda for this week's meetings?
Well, I want to ensure that all the good things that have been happening in the bank over recent months and years continue. I want to ensure the modernization program keeps going strongly. I want to see the private sector, which has such a huge role to play in development, enhanced, augmented the work that is happening on all of that. Those are the sort of things we need to drive forward at this week's annual meeting.
There's a lot of focus this week on gender equality and the effects of inequality on development. What can we learn from DFID's experience with gender?
Well, the first thing we did when the coalition government came to power in Britain nearly 2 years ago was to say that putting girls and women at the centre of all of our development effort would be a critical priority, and that is what we have done. We understand that you have to see development through the lens of a girl's life and a woman's life, and this year, in July, our Prime Minister will host a big meeting in London designed to drive forward a family planning agenda so that women have choice over whether and when they have children. And we're going to crowd in political support for that, funding for it, so that we can try and take very large numbers of women who today do not have contraception and want it, so that they can space their families to give them that capacity. And that's a key example of the way in which we've put girls and women at the centre of our agenda.
That's great. We've had a lot of questions online for you. The first one is, given the state of the global economy right now, what should developing countries do to become self-sufficient? That question's from Tanzania.
Well, Tanzania is quite a good example of the fact that Africa is expected to see, countries in Africa, some of the largest rates of growth over the next few years. What is going to drive development in Africa? Above all, it's stopping conflict and conflict resolution, but it's also allowing the private sector to work its magic. The private sector is the engine of development, wealth creation, economic growth, having a job. These are the ways in which poor people lift themselves out of poverty, and that should be a top priority for Africa and indeed for all countries as we seek to augment the international growth agenda.
And of course, in East Africa, we've seen the success of M-Pesa and a lot of mobile-based innovation in the private sector that's been quite exciting.
Absolutely, and of course, M-Pesa co-invented, as it were, by Vodafone and by Britain.
Yes.
A few years ago now.
Yes, and I believe supported a bit by DFID as well.
DFID, absolutely. DFID made the decision to put the grant in, which, together with Vodafone, enabled this brilliant technology to make an enormous difference to the lives of very poor people.
That's fantastic. Our next question is from Nigeria. Is the UK shying away from investing in infrastructure development in Africa? He writes, the problem of sustainable energy development is a daunting challenge for my country.
Well, it is, and of course we pay tribute to the work that Ngozi is doing as the Minister of Finance in Nigeria to tackle these energy issues. But the very reverse of your questioner's point is true. Britain has been a huge investor and mover and shaker in the world of infrastructure in Africa. That's why we were heavily involved in driving the tripartite approach, why we've supported Trademark East Africa, Trademark South Africa, tried to make sure the same principles to tackling the physical and non-physical barriers to growth are addressed in West Africa too, through the work of the Private Infrastructure Development Group, the PIDG. Britain is a leading supporter of developing infrastructure as a key way in which you try and drive out poverty in poor parts of the world.
We had several questions online about results, basically asking, your perspective on what the World Bank can do to be even more effective as an organization.
Well, we've made it clear that the focus on results, what happens to this money, accountability, transparency, openness, is at the heart of development. That's how you sustain support in donor countries amongst their electorates, so that they can really see the result of this money. Too much in the past has been left really to reliance on skill in development, of which there is an enormous amount, but we have to account to our own electorates for the way this money is spent, the outputs, the outcomes, the results that are secured, but we also have to account to those we're trying to help, so that people in poor countries can hold their own politicians, their own leaders to account for the way in which this money is spent. The results are at the heart of everything we do in development. The bank has been good at trying to drive forward that agenda. There is more to be done. We will be pressing, as one of the largest IDA supporters, that this focus on results intensifies and covers really everything that we are doing. Accountability is at the heart of development success.
You mentioned IDA, the World Bank's Fund for the Poorest, and when talking about accountability, what's the flip side of accountability for where development is happening in countries? How important is governance to good development?
Absolutely essential. The golden thread of development, which embraces property rights so that poor people are able to harness their assets in a way that can help boost employment and economic activity. Having a system of law and justice so that people know they will be treated fairly in respect of their investments. Having a system which encourages financial opportunity and financial services to take root and expand. Governance is incredibly important, and one of the top priorities of the British government in development is to drive forward this golden thread I've described of development in the future.
So we've talked about private sector, women and girls, we talked about governance, accountability, but there's also an increasing focus on fragile states and conflict states. So how do those issues become even more challenging in a fragile or conflict state environment?
Well, conflict, as a brilliant British economist once said, is development in reverse. And working in conflict states is the right thing to do. If you are a girl growing up in a conflict or in a state that is damaged or convulsed by conflict, you are not only having to cope with all the problems of poverty, you're also having to cope with the fact that you are frightened. So tackling conflict, trying to stop it starting, once it started, stopping it, once it's over, reconciling people, which was the reason I first went to Rwanda, to see how on earth people who've been caught up in such a terrible conflict can come together again, is at the heart of development. And the British message on development really is that it is conflict above all which mars people in poverty, but that it is the private sector wealth creation, economic growth, which helps people to lift themselves out of poverty. Aid is a means to an end, it's not an end in itself. And of course it's difficult working in conflict areas because you don't have governance structures, you take more risk inherently by trying to help in areas of conflict. But if we're to have a safer, more prosperous world, this needs to be very high on our agenda.
Well, Secretary of State Andrew Mitchell from the United Kingdom, very much appreciate your time today. And thanks to all of you online for joining us. This has been World Bank Live.